Hey there, would you like to paint this with me? Or maybe this one? Both I did using the same instructions as I'm going to provide coming up. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've seen anything else. Today we're going to be going over a tutorial of a guy and a dog fishing, because it seemed cool. So I'm going to split this up into 4 main categories. Step 1, the drawing. Step 2 and 3, the first and second wash. Step 4, the final wash, as well as touch up and color correction and fixing things that look a bit weird, which seems to always happen. So step 1 here, I'm actually using a watercolor pencil. And I chose that, and I chose it in red because it seemed to show up better on camera. And also using a watercolor pencil. Shout out to James Gurney. He's got an awesome YouTube channel. Love that guy. Watercolor pencils, I started using kind of because he brought it up, but they'll dissolve once you start putting water on the paper. So you don't have to worry about pencil lines showing up underneath your drawing. Now, if you don't have watercolor pencils, feel free to go ahead and use a regular pencil. Just be careful not to draw too heavy. I could not have drawn dark enough so that it shows up on camera, but also so that I could have erased it and not had bright pencil lines show up underneath the painting itself, which would have been kind of ugly. This video is done in double speed, so while you're watching it, if you're trying to follow along, if you need to, go ahead and go into the settings and kick it back to half speed if you want to get the normal speed that this video was shot in. Also, I put headers up so that you can see where each of the steps starts, so that you can follow along without too much problems finding where you should be. That said, don't worry about being a tremendous drawer in order to get this drawing down. It really is just a horizon line placed a little bit lower than halfway up the page. The page I'm working on there is a 9-inch by 12-inch. It does help to have a little bit larger paper. That way you've just got a little bit more room to draw your figures in a reasonable proportion. I don't want to go too crazy trying to explain how to do the drawing itself, but it's really just shapes done kind of with straight lines, more or less, because it's silhouetted, so the shapes themselves aren't going to matter too much to the final, so long as you work them out in the end, they're gonna look reasonable, because you're not really adding any kind of shadow and form to them. So that's the nice thing about doing a silhouette drawing. So go ahead and pause it if you need to, back at the image of the finished drawing there, and copy as best you can. I do want to take one quick second here and talk about the brushes I'm going to be using, and the brushes that hopefully you do have with you. I have a 1-inch flat brush, 1 or 1.5. It doesn't matter. You want a nice big brush though. The one I'm using is just a Walmart painting brush used for doing trim, and it works great for being just kind of a wetting brush. And even if you want to paint with it, it works great for that too, so long as you're not trying to do really fine objects. I also have a smaller round brush. The size doesn't matter too much, but the bigger is usually better for most things that aren't fine details. And the other 2 brushes I use one very small brush just for some very fine details, line work, to outline shapes, as well as to do some of the finer lines in the water. That's a very, very small brush. 0 or 1 probably, as long as it's a nice fine pointed brush, Even if it's larger, as long as it can come to a fine point, it'll be totally fine. The last brush I do use, it's not completely necessary, but it is helpful when you're doing watercolor, is a mop brush. And you'll see that one in the video. It's real bushy. It is not a precision tool. It's just a big old honkin', hold a lot of water, make soft edges kind of brush. So you could get away with, at bare minimum, if you had to, a large flat brush and a good round brush that comes to a nice fine point. So we are in step 2 here. This is the first wash. We're going to start working the sky, the water, and all the main shapes with a first overpass, basically. That means we're going to be working with the thinnest paint. We're going to do, if you saw the previous video, the watercolor basics, I go over paint consistency, but we're going to be using the kind of water consistency here. You want the paint to be more or less the consistency of water, nice and runny. In this case, because I know it's going to be sky I'm working on, I've drawn 2 nice bright colors, my lemon yellow and I believe that's just called bright red. But I'm not mixing them with anything. I want them to be as pure as possible. Even though being watered down, they're not going to be super bright. They're going to be more or less transparent, and they are going to mix together quite a bit. But I want bright, pure colors for the sky, at least to start with, see where it goes. So I am going to wet down the page real quick. I've got a nice 1.5 inch. It's either a 1 inch or a 1.5 inch brush. It's just a painter's brush from Walmart that I use to wet the paper. It actually works better than my 1 inch flat brush that came with my watercolor paintbrush set. So, hey man, use what you got. We are not going for anything perfect here. You've all seen a sunset before. I am going for sunset here. We're going to keep warmer, brighter colors towards the horizon, darker, bluer colors or cooler colors towards the top. I am careful here not to mix blue into the sky, just because then you end up with green, and skies usually aren't green unless there's a tornado somewhere, so don't do that, at least not right away. Once that dries and we're doing a second pass, I do add a darker, like bluer color to it. I am adding purple in up here, just because I do want there to be a nice blending, a gradient happening, where the top is darker. And actually my paper was very wet here, so what you're going to see is that's going to dry very light and not nearly as vibrant as I liked. So in the first drawing of this that I did, I got my colors a little more correct the first pass through, so everything stayed really, really vibrant. I didn't do all the extra work I did here, but I actually like how this one turned out better. So there's nothing wrong with putting it down on the paper and then seeing where it's going and correcting it after. And often you're going to end up with a better result with the extra layers of paint. Watercolor is awesome that way, given that it's transparent. You can really work with what you've done in a previous layer, provided you are working progressively thicker paint over what's ever been laid down previously. So as I'm moving into the water here below the sky, what you just saw me mix was essentially sort of a general mix of what the sky color was, but a little bit darker and a little more grayed down. So it's kind of an orange. I added a little bit of blue to it to desaturate the orange. I want it to be darker than the sky because it's a reflection in the water, but also a similar color scheme. And then I'm going to gradient that sky color into a blue watercolor. And it shouldn't be very bright blue. So I'm going to desaturate that blue that I mixed too. So that would be just taking a little bit of blue, adding a bit of orange to it, a little bit, just to knock down the blueness of the blue. Because if you're going to look at a scene in the evening time, you're not going to see bright saturated blue in the water, most likely. you're going to see desaturated, high contrast values. That's what you're going to end up seeing. So that's what you want to try and emulate in the painting you're creating here. What you're going to see here is I flipped the board right upside down. I actually have it on a board, and I have a thing under the board to keep it at an angle. Usually that's how you paint with watercolor. So it is nice to be able to turn it upside down if you want to, say, make the bottom darker and have it run smoothly towards the middle. See, in this painting we are trying to go for brighter values towards the middle of the page, and also the water against the bottom edge of this painting would be naturally darker. And also I wasn't quite happy with just how blue I got that water at first, and it's still damp, so just going to go in and darken it up a little bit and blue it up a little bit, and then move on. Also, I am mixing up a dark color for the trees that are going to be on the opposite bank, as well as the general dark color of the dock that they're sitting on, as well as the foreground land and grasses. You always see me, or most of the time see me, hit whatever I start working on with a little bit of water. And that is not particularly necessary, but I want everything far away to be soft edges. And mostly for the whole painting, I want everything to be pretty soft edges. If you have any kind of harsh lines, it's going to most likely stand out. And there's a time for that, but this painting really isn't the time for that. I mean, water is soft, the sky is soft, you want trees in the distance to be soft. The hardest edges that you see in this are going to be on the silhouetted images, the silhouetted people, the guy and the dog, and like the grasses that pop up in the foreground. So it's usually better. I know that stuff in the background has dried somewhat significantly, and I want to add a little bit of water. So it is still the first pass, and it's still a pretty liquidy layer of paint. But if I were to leave that liquidy layer without kind of pre-moistening the area, it would probably cause some problems. It might bloom and push some of the sky color out of the way that has started to dry, and I don't want that to happen. I want it to kind of all blend together. Plus, adding the water helps you pull some of those colors. See, I haven't stayed right along that horizon line, and there's not really a reason to. We're assuming that there's water below it, and there's no reason not to have the colors of that foliage bleed into the water and into the orangish blue mixture that's right there at the edge of the skyline. If anything, it'll definitely help. And in one of the next passes, we'll go in and reinforce where that horizon line is with a nice dark color to delineate the bank from the water. One thing to take note of here is your colors aren't super important. I went pretty much with primaries for the demonstration, mostly because I wanted good, clean, bright colors, especially in the sky, and everywhere else doesn't necessarily matter so much. See, we grade the colors down in the water, and I am, well, in the sketch in my mind, I wanted the dock and the foreground to be dark, but like a warm dark. So I went at mixing like a purple, a dark purple, and adding in its opposite to kind of gray it out. It came out a lot bluer than I intended, though still darker than everything else in the painting. And also the trees in the background there. I would have intended for those to be darker and somewhat neutral, but they're very clearly green and too bright. But we correct all of that in following washes. So, like I said, there's always room to see things that you don't like and correct them in the next pass. So what you do see me do in a following layer is mix a very definitely warm dark. Actually, I mix a similar color to what I have here, if not even more purple, and mix in burnt sienna. So it's just a wallop of earthy red. Burnt sienna is also pretty opaque, the one I have in my palette, so it covers a lot of what is there. Whereas, you know, if you look at it as is right now, it's just a bright blue thing that doesn't really make sense. But we correct that in a following layer. So if yours looks like that, don't worry. If you got the colors a little bit more correct on the first pass, awesome. Good job. One last quick thing to note before we move on to step 3. If you drew with pencil, hopefully you drew light enough that the lines aren't going to show after you've laid down all your paint. I drew with the watercolor pencil, and most of my lines have pretty much disappeared. I can still see a hint of the original figure drawing in the middle there on the dog, but it's mostly gone. And I didn't like the dog that I drew, but you end up drawing with the paint anyway, so hopefully your lines are visible enough for what you need them for. Otherwise, you'll end up drawing it with the paint anyway. So don't worry too much about that, and we hit the figures in the next layer. I wanted to spend the time in this particular step for me getting most of the values and colors where I wanted them before I went and fixed the figures in place. Just a second ago, you saw me kind of feel the paper. Took a short break there, made sure the paper was completely dry, so that's what I was checking. It was nice and dry. We're moving into the next step, the second wash. This is where we're just going to continue to color correct and add more layers on top of what we already have. I am not starting the sky yet. The sky is definitely not done. If you like it that way, it certainly could be. I wanted it to be even more vibrant, richer. And part of that is having darker values as well as some more bright colors. But for this one, I am focusing on hoping to get a final pass on the trees in the background, as well as getting some nice dark values in the water. And you'll see what I mean there, but I'm going for a blue-green, a dark blue-green, because especially in the evening, you're not going to see greens. You're definitely not going to see bright colors appearing in front of a light source like that. So as this is a silhouette, I want to really get those main objects, that being the trees in the background, as well as the dock and the figures, and the foreground land, nice and dark without having terribly noticeable color to them. You are seeing me put that same foliage color right in the water. You would expect that because the water is going to reflect a similar value in color as what is nearby it. So we are pretty accurate on that. That's nearly a final pass on the water. There's going to be a little bit more playing with it as we move on, but you want to get your brush strokes somewhat what you'll want them to look like there. For water, that definitely means horizontal strokes. You're always going to use horizontal strokes in water, and try and make it look organic. So you don't want even lines, even in length, even in spacing. We humans have a tendency to, when we draw or paint things, way over organize them, such that you end up with, say if you're drawing 3 clouds in the sky, you're going to draw 3 clouds the same length, equally spaced apart, and that's not natural. You want to go for an organic look, which kind of means, if you have to, paint with whichever hand is your opposite hand. And it'll kind of make a disconnect in your brain where you're not trying to control it as much. Natural objects tend to have an inconsistent consistency about them. And that takes time to just practice drawing things that you see that are natural shapes, so clouds and sky and water and things like that, and getting a feel for what kind of inconsistency pops up and what the general rules of the thing are. And it's kind of cool because it makes it so you can, if you get used to that, you know, draw things from the mind's eye that look natural even though they're completely made up, because nature has rules, but not totally fixed, consistent rules every single time. So bear with me, we are moving to the foreground pieces, the dock, the grass in the front of it, and the figures on top of it. We're still in the second wash, even though we're kind of bouncing around a little bit, and I decided I was kind of happy with where the water is at the moment, so I'm moving on to the rest of the things I want to get ironed out. You can really do the different things within the step at whatever point you want, because they're not interfering with each other too much. I will say that saving that stuff on the bottom, at least for me, helps me to not ham fist, stick my hand in the wet paint, which I actually did here at some point. Trying to zoom in so you can see me carving out the figures. Now, I don't really have the lines appearing for me here, but I've drawn that figure like 4 times now, so it's sort of in the memory banks, but hopefully you have your pencil lines to follow. I did save this for a mid-step for me, just because I wanted to have the other stuff in place. But what that also means is that's going to be a dark figure against a light background, and there's not going to be a lot of room to fix it if it goes wrong. So if you need your shapes ironed out better and you don't have your pencil lines, wait for what you've already done here in step 3 to dry some, and you can go back in with your pencil and draw in those shapes. And to a degree, as long as you're doing it lightly, you can erase those pencil marks. But do what you need to do to be able to draw the shapes correctly, more or less the first time. Because if you're putting a dark pigment down, you're probably not going to get it off if you need to. Something about dogs. Whenever I draw them from memory, they all look like Scottish Terriers. I don't know why that is. I did grow up with Scottish Terriers. But cool little dude. Getting out the big flat brush, and once again I'm trying to correct the colors on the edges in the foreground there. This is where I'm going to add in some grasses. That's why I'm wetting down the edge of the dock along the water and the edge of the grasses in the foreground. I don't want them to have terribly hard edges, and a lot of that has dried enough, such that I'm going to just re-wet it a little bit. And then take a finer brush. This is where you can use your round brush with a nice point. Get a relatively runny paint. You want it to run and not just blob. But I'm just going to do some general shapes. And remember, same thing as the water, you want an organic look and feel to it. So don't make all your grass the same height. Don't space it all the same. Have some of it have nice hard edges, but some of it have soft edges, and the eye gets confused because it assumes it's natural looking. So that's how, when you look at a scene, the brain science of it is that you're not looking at the whole thing. Your mind is kind of piecing things together. So in painting, to make things look a little bit more realistic, a little bit more natural, you can achieve that by having a mix of soft and hard shapes and a mix of values. And it's just how the mind perceives things that you can try to emulate as an artist to make things have a natural appearance. You saw me correct the color of that dock, and it is the value I kind of want it now, at least. But my first dock was extremely blue, and now this one sort of has a greenish blue. I did not get it quite the color I want, and I do go back and hit that, and I just slop just a relatively red right over top of it, and it does fix it, but it takes work. So here we're adding another dark pass, which actually I believe is the same color I put on the dock. So just a very, very dark it's dark enough you can't really tell if it's green or blue or what, but it doesn't necessarily matter because you don't see that color particularly. You see a dark value. So near enough to black, basically. Using that same dark color to reinforce some darker grasses up in the front, they end up blending right into the foreground shapes there. So it's not like you're adding something terribly, noticeable in there, and you don't want to. But it's nice to have that variation in value, even if it's a variation in darks. And the lines that you streaked across the water up there, again, just like when we added in the other values into the water, try and make it nice and organic. Those lines that you see when water is rippling, they don't tend to meet up. They make kind of weird overlapping and sometimes crisscrossing shapes, and you're just shooting for something generally organic looking, and there's not going to be a necessarily one right way to put those in, but so long as they're not, all even, consistent, parallel lines, it'll probably look pretty good. You see me darkening the figures in the foreground. A little bit of artistic choice there, compositional choice, really. I want those figures to be the center point, them and the sky, right? And so far we've succeeded in having a very light background appearing around them, and they're nearly the darkest thing in the painting. So what we've achieved there is a high degree of contrast. That definitely would be what you would see in real life, and it does function within a painting to guide the viewer's eye to that spot. So that's what we've achieved there. It doesn't look consistently dark in this shot. However, that is very thick dark paint, and it's still drying, so the camera is just kind of picking up reflectivity. You see in the image at the end that it's definitely all the way dark. Going into darken and add a little bit of shape into the dock and the foreground. I'm imagining, a rickety plank of a short dock or pier or something with the boards like buckled and curling and being weathered. So I'm just kind of scraping in lines to insinuate edges of dock boards and stuff like that. And again, there's going to be no perfectly correct way to do that. I mean, unless you were looking at maybe an image of an actual dock and trying to copy it, but I'm not recommending that here. I'm adding in the dark lines, and then I actually just smooth it out anyway. But the idea is that they're there enough that even once it's all softened and kind of blurred a little bit, they still kind of suggest an old weathered dock, and that's what we're after. We're nearing the end of the second wash. Like I said, even that foreground now is the dock and the foregrass there is still definitely too green for me, and I go back and fix that in the end. You'll see that. But right now we're going to be moving into the sky. So you're going to see me mix up a pretty vibrant purple. It helps a lot in painting to kind of work different areas at different times. So moving into the last wash, the biggest problem to solve is for me going to be getting that sky exactly how I want it, and then moving on to color correct and value correct the rest of it. A lot of painting is keying in your values. Part of value is color, so it's not always perfectly easy to tell if your colors or values are correct until you have other elements within the painting, kind of set how you want them. So throughout the different steps, first and second and third wash, we are building towards a goal. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time, but you have to kind of push different elements and check their relation to each other. And that's why we're moving on to the sky now. It's time. The sky's very bright. I know I want it to be more sunsetty than it is now, and a little bit more, cloudy. What I had in mind was just a nice look at the clouds kind of sunset. And so we're taking that dark purple. I'm pre-wetting the background there. Not nearly as much as I did the first time I tried to get the sky in, because that didn't quite work out the way I wanted to, although it did make a good foundation to do what I'm going to be doing now. Just like the water, clouds are very organic. You don't want, too many repeating shapes. You don't want consistently sized or shaped or spaced things. So I'm just kind of trying to be as random as possible, and then I go in with just a clean watery brush and soften the edges that I've put down there to build up sort of kind of a layer of what I'm imagining the clouds are going to look like. You can find reference images of clouds to, get an idea of, but the general rule that I'm trying to follow here is lighter, warmer tones down towards the horizon, darker purpley tones towards the top. So when you would look at a sunset, it's going to be bright where the sun is down at the horizon, and then the sky is going to get darker as you look up. So that's the general rule we're trying to follow. Next here, I'm adding in nice bright reds. They are going to mix and blend somewhat with the purple, and because that background is still damp, and that's just kind of another general rule to follow. You're going to have closest to the sun like a white or a yellow kind of, and then moving away from it, it's going to be orangey, and then moving further away, it's going to be red, and moving further away, it's going to be purple and blue and such. So I put those colors in, and then I'm kind of just blending them back out. So it seems silly, but I wasn't really using a reference here. I was getting the sense in my mind for how I wanted the gradient to be, and then where I thought it was too strong, I blended it out, and now I've got the image in my head kind of fixed. So now I'm trying to push the idea that there are clouds receding into the distance, and so towards the middle, they're going to be smaller shapes, and towards the top, they're going to get larger. So as a matter of perspective, you're going to see things get smaller in the distance and rise and become thicker and larger towards the top. I'm not going to fuss around with the yellow. That yellow is pretty spot on, not too terribly bright. It's not screaming at you, "Hey, I'm yellow!" But now it's time to get final darks into the sky. So I mixed up a nice dark, relatively thicker than what already has been laid down, kind of purple blue. It's somewhere in between. It's not like you're going to stare at that and go, "Ah, purple." I want it to be dark, but I don't want it to be loud and attention grabby. And then another cool thing to keep in mind, if you've ever looked at clouds, they are lighter on the side facing the light and darker away from it. So I'm trying to take that dark color that I'm using as a dark sky or dark cloud color and put it on the opposite side of where I'm imagining the light is. So the cloud is going to have like a yellow toward one side facing the sun. It's going to transition to that reddy pinkish orange, and then have a dark purple that kind of gives it a final shape, basically. But I like how that sky turned out, and if you focus on not making it too regular, yours will look good too. I am darkening up the trees in the background of Final Touch, they still appear very green. I don't want them to appear green, so also they can be darker. So I am, well actually, I'm trying to correct for the foreground first here. That's where I said I did mix up a dark mixture that has burnt sienna in it. I figured that would be good and covering, and it definitely is. That's also where I got the mop brush out, because it's really good at just laying down a big old gob of whatever you're doing. But there I laid down a nice thick bit of paint and then used a little water to push it all over the dock. And as a final color correction there, I think it did the job. It knocked out the green, which was what I was hoping the slightly reddish mixture would do, and really fully darkened it up and made all of those foreground features somewhat more homogeneous, which was definitely the goal. Silhouettes should pretty much have a nice solid dark value, and they shouldn't have a whole lot of color variation for sure. If you were to set up a camera to take a picture like this and have a perfect silhouette, it wouldn't capture any color. It's just how we see things in the dark. Your eyes are going to focus on the bright stuff in the back, and you're going to miss whatever color and differences in value exist in the main shapes towards you. Last thing I think I work on right here is just correcting those main shapes there in the grass, trying to correct the spot where I plopped my hand in the paint there. And I do darken up the trees in the background. They're too green. They stand out. You don't want things to stand out that aren't supposed to stand out. So adding a little water, softening the edges, adding a little water so that the edges remain somewhat soft. And then really it's darker than what's already there and bluer than what's already there. So hopefully it's covering the green, which it does. And that'll be it for the trees. Remember, trees also organic shapes. Pretty much just try not to make everything the same size, and it will somewhat appear natural. And that's the idea. And anywhere it kind of stands out to me, I go back in and poke and prod and make something a little different, or give something a weird whatever doozy mahickey. Very final step in this, and I saved it for last once everything was in place, is the fishing pole. No solid rule in mind here. Although I did make the mistake while I was sketching out the imagined figure, where I had that fishing pole in somewhat of the wrong place, and it looked different. So I made sure, drawing this one, to really put the fishing pole away from this poor dude's torso so it didn't look inappropriate. I used a ruler to get most of that fishing line in. People with a nice stable hand definitely get a nice clean line in, but I see it not cheating to use tools. Use rulers. I have compasses. I have lots of different drawing tools that, hey, why not? Use what you got. I almost feel like this painting needs, like right in the sky, some nice script lettering that says "Gone Fishing." I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do that. It'd be cool though, I think. Maybe. Put it on your like office door. People leave you alone. Like, hey, see ya, I'm out. Gone fishing. So, hope you enjoyed this. If you do it, post it in the comments. I'd love to see it. Also, leave any questions. I'll answer them, and if there's anything else you would like to see, leave a suggestion. I will see what I can do. Thanks for watching. And now, a word from our sponsor.